Rain started somewhere outside of Knoxville. I remember because I'd just passed the exit for the rest stop, where my wife and I used to pull over when the kids were small. She'd pack sandwiches in a cooler, turkey and Swiss, always, and the kids would race to the picnic tables like they'd been cooped up for weeks instead of 2 hours. That rest stop looked different now. Bigger. New signs. I slowed down a little as I passed it, the way you do when something familiar has changed just enough to make you feel like a stranger. The wipers were working hard, not quite keeping up. I'd left Asheville at 6 in the morning to make it to my son's wedding rehearsal dinner in Louisville. 7 hours in good weather, maybe 8 with the rain. My truck, a 2009 F-150 that I've had since before my wife got sick, doesn't do well in the wet. The defroster on the passenger side gave out last winter, and I keep meaning to fix it, keep meaning to trade the whole thing in, but there's something about that truck I can't let go of yet. My wife used to sit in that passenger seat. I'm not ready to stop seeing the ghost of her there. My son, I'll call him by what he is, my boy, my only child, had called me 3 weeks before the wedding, not to talk really, to inform. The rehearsal dinner was Friday at 7, the ceremony Saturday at 2, reception to follow. Black tie preferred. He said, preferred, like that was a kindness. I told him I'd be there. He said, Dad, you don't have to come all the way from Asheville in November. I said, a father doesn't miss his son's wedding rehearsal. There was a pause on his end, the kind of pause that has a whole conversation inside it that nobody wants to have out loud. Okay, he said finally, we'll see you Friday. That was the whole call. I want to tell you something before I get to what happened at the house, because context matters in a story like this, and I've spent enough time since then trying to figure out where things went wrong that I think I finally understand the shape of it. My name is Frank Dolan. I'm 64 years old. I spent 31 years as a structural engineer, bridges mostly, a few highway overpasses, 2 federal contracts I'm still proud of. I retired 4 years ago when my wife Patricia was diagnosed with early onset Alzheimer's at 59. She needed me home, so I came home. That's what you do. Patricia passed away 14 months ago. What most people don't know, what my son and his fiancée certainly didn't know, is that when I retired, I sold my share of the engineering firm I'd co-founded back in 1998. My partner and I had built it from nothing, 2 guys with licenses and a borrowed office space in Charlotte, into something that employed 43 people and held contracts in 6 states. When I sold my half, after taxes, after the estate planning attorney structured everything properly, I walked away with a little over $3 million. I didn't tell my son. Part of that was Patricia. She was old-fashioned about money, in a way I always respected. People treat you differently when they know, she used to say. And she was right. Her own sister had borrowed $40,000 from us in 2003, and the relationship never recovered. Not because of the money itself, but because of what knowing about the money did to her sister's perception of who we were. So I kept it quiet. I drove the old truck. I wore the same Carhartt jacket I've had for 12 years. I kept the house in Asheville, modest, 3 bedrooms, paid off since 2019, and I let my son believe his father was a retired engineer, living on Social Security and a pension. I don't say any of this to justify what happened. I say it because you need to understand why what I overheard hit me the way it did. I pulled into Louisville a little after 3 in the afternoon. The rain had followed me the whole way up I-65. I found a Hampton Inn about 2 miles from my son's house, checked in, cleaned up. The rehearsal dinner was at their place, his fiancée's idea. She wanted something intimate, and I told him I'd arrive around 6:30. I put on my good blazer, navy wool blend, bought it for Patricia's brother's retirement party in 2018. I looked at myself in the bathroom mirror for a long moment. 64 years old, grey at the temples, lines around the eyes, Hands that have worked hard enough that the knuckles don't fully straighten anymore. I looked like exactly what I was, an old man getting dressed up to watch his son get married. I was proud of my son. I want to be clear about that, even now. He'd done well, software sales, good income, nice house in a neighborhood with mature trees and clean sidewalks. He'd met his fiancée 2 years ago at some work event, and when he brought her home for Thanksgiving last year, she seemed pleasant enough, polished, the kind of person who knows exactly which fork to use and uses it. I drove over in the rain. I parked on the street because the driveway was already full. Her parents' Lexus, a couple of cars I didn't recognize. I sat in the truck for a minute, listening to the rain on the roof. It's a sound I've always loved. Patricia loved it too. We used to lie in bed on rainy nights and not say anything, just listen. I got out, turned my collar up against the wet, and walked up the front path. I was maybe 10 feet from the front door when I heard them through the open kitchen window. The light was on. The window was cracked a few inches at the bottom. Fogged glass, warm air escaping into the November cold. I heard my son's fiancée first. I'll call her what she was to me in that moment, a stranger. She was laughing. That particular kind of laugh that's aimed at something, not with something. Just hope he doesn't show up in that truck, she was saying. I swear every time I see a photo of him, he's in that same jacket. Like he owns one jacket. Someone else laughed. Female voice, probably her mother or her sister. I'd meet them both later and still couldn't have told you which was which. Then my son's voice, he's not going to embarrass you. I'm not worried about me, she said. I'm worried about the Hargrove table. Do you know how long it took me to get the Hargroves to come? They are not the kind of people who warm up to a small pause, a gesture I couldn't see that. My son was quiet. I just think, she continued, and her voice had shifted into something more careful, that we should probably talk to him this weekend. About the house. The Asheville house. It's a 3-bedroom, babe. It's just sitting there. He's one person. It's his house. I know it's his house. I know it's his house. I'm just saying. Her voice was light, practiced, the way you talk when you've had this conversation inside your own head many times before taking it public. It doesn't make financial sense for one person to hold on to a house that size when there are options. And with the baby coming, I went very still on the front par. We could use the help, is all. You know what real estate is doing in that market. He could sell, move into something smaller, assisted living maybe in a few years when it makes sense, and we'd be in a position to, okay, my son said. Not firmly, not the way a man says okay, that's enough. He said it the way a man says okay, that's enough. He said it the way a man says okay, I hear you, let's revisit this later. I stood there in the rain for a moment longer than I probably should have. Then I turned around, walked back to my truck, sat down in the driver's seat, and stared at the windshield. The rain kept coming. I want to tell you what that felt like, but I'm not sure I have the exact right words. It wasn't rage. It was something quieter and colder than rage. The feeling of a floor dropping away slowly. The feeling of realizing that a version of your life you believed in was not entirely real. My son had not defended me. He'd said he's not going to embarrass you, and then he'd listened to a conversation about selling my home and moving me toward assisted living, and he had said, okay. Patricia would have known what to do. She always did. She had this gift for seeing past the surface of a moment to the thing underneath it. She would have taken my hand in the truck right then, and she would have said something simple and true. But Patricia was gone, so I sat alone in my truck, in the rain, outside my son's house, and I made a decision. I was going to go inside. I was going to be gracious. I was going to sit at the rehearsal dinner and eat whatever was served and be polite to the Hargroves and say the right things about the wedding tomorrow. And then, before I went back to the Hampton Inn that night, I was going to call my estate attorney. not out of revenge, or not only out of revenge, but because what I'd heard through that window had clarified something I'd been slow to see. My son had stopped thinking of me as a person and started thinking of me as a situation to be managed. And a man who has worked 31 years and built something from nothing and cared for his wife through 4 years of Alzheimer's and driven 7 hours in the rain to show up for his kid. That man is not a situation. That man is a father, and fathers are allowed to protect themselves. I went inside. Her mother opened the door, silver-haired silk blouse, the kind of grip in a handshake that's been practiced. She smiled at me warmly enough and took my wet jacket and said something about the drive. I thanked her for having me. The living room was arranged carefully, flowers on every surface, candles, the kind of effort that says we are performing elegance. There were about 15 people, mostly her family and their circle, a few of my son's work colleagues I recognized from photos. My son came across the room when he saw me. He hugged me. He smelled like a department store. "Dad, you made it." "Of course," I said. He looked at me, really looked, for just a second, and I could see something flicker behind his eyes. Not guilt, exactly. Something more like calculation. Like he was trying to read my face for information. I gave him nothing. The fiancée came over and kissed my cheek and said how happy she was. I'd driven all this way. She was charming. I've noticed that people who are charming in company are often the most honest when they think no one is watching. And what she'd been honest about 20 minutes ago through a kitchen window was the only version of her I now trusted. I shook hands with the Hargroves. They were fine people, actually. Jim Hargrove had done something in commercial real estate. His wife taught at a university. Their daughter was the maid of honor. They asked me what I'd done before retiring, and I said structural engineering, and Jim asked which firm, and when I told him the name, his eyebrows went up just slightly. "Dolan and Marsh," he said. "You're that Dolan?" I said I was. His wife said, "They did the Mercer Street overpass. Jim practically drove out of his way for a year just to go over it." Jim laughed. "That is an exceptionally built overpass." I thanked them. I could feel my son watching from across the room. Dinner was served at 7:30. Catered, Italian, good food. I sat between Jim Hargrove and a woman named Phyllis, who'd been the fiancé's college roommate. Phyllis talked about her kids. I talked about the drive-up. The wine was a Napa cab I would have chosen myself. The toast started around 9. Her father went first, long, warm, very prepared. Her mother followed. Then my son's best man, who'd been his college roommate and had a good sense of humor about it. People laughed. Then my son turned to me. "Dad," he said, half rising from his chair, "do you want to say anything?" The table got quiet. 15 faces, candlelight, the sound of rain still against the windows. I set down my glass. I stood up. "I drove 7 hours today," I said. "In the rain. In a truck that's older than some of the people in this room." A few polite chuckles. I drove it because there are things a father shows up for. Full stop. No conditions on that. I looked at my son. He was looking at me with an expression I hadn't seen on him since he was about 12. Open, a little uncertain, the way a kid looks when he doesn't know if he's in trouble or not. "I don't have a lot of wisdom to offer," I continued. "I'm an engineer. I spent my career making sure things that were built to hold weight actually held it. That's what I know how to do." I paused. "A marriage is a structure. The foundation matters more than the decoration. I hope you build on a foundation that will hold." I sat down. Jim Hargrove put his hand briefly on my arm. The fiancée was smiling at me. It was a very good smile, and I was sure, watching it, that she'd already recalculated something about the evening, about me, based on the Mercer Street overpass and the way Jim Hargrove had said my name. I'd seen that kind of recalculation before. It's what happens when people realize a person doesn't fit inside the category they'd filed them in. My son poured me more wine without being asked. I stayed until 10:30, said my goodbyes, thanked everyone, hugged my son at the door. He held on a second longer than usual. "Dad," he said quietly, so only I could hear. "I'm glad you came." I looked at him. He is his mother's eyes in his father's face. He always has been. "I know," I said. "Get some sleep." I drove back to the Hampton Inn in the rain, sat on the edge of the bed in my blazer, shoes still on, called my estate attorney, Arthur Webb. Been with me since 2004, a man who charges enough that I've never doubted his attention, left him a voicemail asking him to call me Monday morning. What I wanted to discuss was the trust structure, the beneficiary arrangements, specifically whether the current setup still reflected my actual intentions. It did not. Not anymore. Not entirely. The wedding the next day was beautiful. November sun, somehow, after all that rain. The ceremony was in a garden venue east of the city, white chairs on wet grass, a string quartet. My son cried when he saw her come down the aisle. I cried a little too, if I'm being honest. I was thinking about Patricia, about our wedding in 1984 in a church in Roanoke that doesn't exist anymore, about how she'd looked at me at the altar with an expression that said, "I see exactly who you are, and I'm choosing you anyway." That's the only thing worth looking for in another person, the willingness to see clearly and still choose. I shook hands with the groom, my son, at the reception. I danced one song with the bride, who was a graceful dancer and thanked me sincerely for coming, and I believe she was sincere in that particular moment. People are complicated. They can want your house and also be glad you showed up. Both things can be true simultaneously, and learning to hold that without it destroying you is, I think, one of the actual disciplines of getting older. I left the reception at 7, drove back toward Asheville with the windows down despite the cold because the air smelled clean. After all that rain, and I needed to think. Arthur Webb called Monday morning at 8:45. He is a punctual man. I told him what I'd heard through the kitchen window. He listened without interrupting, the way good attorneys do. When I finished, he said, "What would you like to do?" I told him. I didn't want to disinherit my son. He is my son. That's permanent. But I wanted to restructure the trust so that any distribution above basic living support, if and when it came to that, would be tied to conditions. Not punitive conditions, reasonable ones. A required relationship. Regular visits, the kind of thing a son should do anyway. Not because there's money attached, but since it was apparently not going to happen on its own, I needed to build it into the architecture. I also told Arthur that I was going to tell my son about the money. Not all of it at once, but enough, because the conversation I'd overheard hadn't only been about my house. It had been a conversation that could only happen in a vacuum of information. My son and his wife had been making plans in the dark, and some of that was my fault for keeping too many lights off. Arthur said that was wise. I said, "I'm an engineer. We fix structures before they collapse, not after." He said he'd have the amended documents ready within 2 weeks. I called my son on a Thursday evening, about 10 days after the wedding. He answered on the third ring, sounding slightly distracted, which meant he was probably still at his desk. "Dad! Hey, everything okay?" "Everything's fine," I said. "I just wanted to talk. Do you have a few minutes?" He did. We talked for a while about small things, the drive home, the wedding photos, how the honeymoon had been. He sounded lighter after the wedding. Happy, I think, in the real way. Then I said, "I need to tell you something I should have told you a few years ago." He got quiet. I told him about the firm, about the sale, about the number which I gave him plainly, without drama. He didn't say anything for a long moment. "Dad," he finally said, "why didn't you?" Your mother didn't want people to know. And then she got sick and then she was gone and I just kept the habit. He was quiet again. I heard you, I said. A few nights ago, before the rehearsal dinner, through the kitchen window, I heard the conversation about the house. The silence this time was different. Fuller, the kind of silence that has real weight in it. Dad, you don't have to explain it right now, I said. I'm not calling to have a fight. I'm calling because I should have given you better information, and I didn't, and that's on me. But I want you to know that house is my home. It's where your mother died. I'm not selling it. He said quietly, I know. I'm sorry. I know you are, I said. And I did know. That's the hard part. He's not a bad man, my son. He loves me in the way that sons who haven't yet had to lose someone love their fathers, abstractly, incompletely, with too much still taken for granted. That changes. It always changes. I just hope he gets there before it's too late to have done something about it. We talked for another 20 minutes. It was the longest real conversation we'd had in 3 years. When we hung up, I sat in the kitchen of my Asheville house for a while. The good kitchen with the window over the sink that looks out into the backyard where Patricia's rose bushes are still growing, unpruned just the way she left them. I'm not going anywhere. I built things my whole career that were meant to last, things that hold weight, that bend without breaking, that stand up to conditions nobody predicted when they were designed. I know how to build for the long term, and I know this. A man who drives 7 hours in the rain for his son, who shows up in the old truck, who stands at a dinner table and means every word he says, that man is not a burden. He is the foundation, and the foundation doesn't move. Tell me in the comments, has someone you loved ever made you feel like a problem to be solved? I'd like to know I'm not the only one. I've had a lot of time to sit with what happened that November, not obsessing over it. I'm too old for that, and honestly too tired. But sitting with it the way you sit with a repair you've made to something important, checking it now and then to see if it's holding. Here's what I've come to understand. What my son and his wife said through that kitchen window wasn't cruelty exactly. It was something more ordinary than cruelty, and in some ways harder to make peace with. It was carelessness, the kind that grows quietly in a relationship when one person stops seeing the other as fully real. When a father becomes a line item, when a home becomes square footage, when a man who drove 7 hours in the rain becomes a logistical problem to solve before the Hargroves arrive. And I have to be honest with myself about my own part in it. I kept my life a secret from my son for years. I told myself it was principle. Patricia's instinct, her wisdom about money and how it changes people. And that was true, partly. But there was something else in it too, some part of me that didn't want to be seen differently, that wanted to be loved for the man in the old truck, not the man with the trust fund. And what I didn't reckon with is that when you give people too little information, they fill the gap with their own assumptions. My son had assumptions. Some of them were wrong. Some of them were wrong because I let them be. That's the thing about cause and effects that nobody talks about clearly enough. It doesn't always move in a straight line. Sometimes you make a choice that feels protective, feels right, and 10 years later it has become the condition that made something else possible, something you never intended. I chose silence. That silence became a vacuum. The vacuum got filled. What I chose to do after wasn't revenge. I want to be clear about that, even now. Restructuring the trust, telling my son the truth, drawing a line about the house. Those weren't punishments. They were corrections. An engineer doesn't tear down a structure because it developed a stress fracture. He identifies the fracture, understands why it formed, and fixes it with the right material in the right place. The right material, in this case, was honesty. Late honesty, yes. But honesty, yes. My son is a good man who had gotten lazy in the way that people get lazy when they think they already know someone. When he found out, he didn't know me as well as he thought. The firm, the money, what I'd heard, something shifted in him. I could hear it in his voice on the phone. Not shame exactly, more like the feeling of waking up and realizing you've been sleepwalking somewhere important. Patricia used to say that the only real inheritance you leave a child is who they become while you're watching. The money is just money. It goes somewhere eventually, one way or another. But the watching, the showing up in the rain, the standing at the dinner table and meaning what you say, the phone call where you tell the hard truth instead of the easy one, that's the thing that either takes root or it doesn't. I'm still in the Ashill house, the rose bushes need pruning. I keep meaning to get to them. My son called last Sunday. He called just to talk. No agenda, no ask, just to talk. We were on the phone for 40 minutes. At the end, he said, "Same time next week." I said, "Yes." That's enough. That's more than enough. A man who has worked hard and shown up and told the truth and held his ground. That man doesn't need to win. He just needs to know the foundation is still there. Mine is.